Tom Oliver, if he would come and just greet us for a moment.
Well, we're delighted to have you joining us in Hall County today. I think the ones that are regulars to this community will find out we're a great place to live and work and invest your money. We're excited. We're excited about what Virgil Williams and his team is doing for our community in the islands here. And we're also pretty well excited about our delegation. We think they have come a long ways. Representative Mills has done a great job for us there, and Carl Rogers does a great job. And I'd like to say a little bit about James. James and I, you can tell, have a little different physique, as you can tell, okay? Well, let me tell you, he has a son, Micah, isn't that right, James? Mm-hmm. Who's a starting middle linebacker for our local high school team. And I think that's quite an accomplishment. Anybody who's playing football today, they've got a lot of potential. That team has come a long ways. I won't tell you their record right now, but I think at the end of the season it'll be a pleasant surprise. But I'd like to welcome you to our community and thank you for being here and look forward to any way we can help you as Hall County. We're open for business. And once again, thanks again. Thanks, James.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. You ought to run for office. That's great. Appreciate that. There'll be a slideshow presentation of my son's football feats afterward. Thank you, Tom. We are glad to have you here in Hall County, and there are a lot of great things going on here in this exact location. But we're here today to conduct our next scheduled meeting of the Comprehensive Tax Reform Study Committee meeting. And we'll be having another meeting following this, and looking forward to that. That'll, I believe, will be chaired by Representative Chuck Martin. If we could, I'll just ask all of the members, if they would, just to remember that the mics are live, and if you would just share one. As we go down the line here, I'd like to ask our esteemed chairman, if you would, just to introduce yourself and tell the folks what area you represent.
Hello, everybody. I'm Larry O'Neill from the Middle Georgia District of 146 in Houston County, and I think you were trying to tell me the mic was live because I was chewing that thing. I'm sorry. Welcome, everybody. We're glad to be with you.
Richard Royal. I'm from District 171. It's Colquitt and Mitchell County in southwest Georgia.
Good afternoon. I'm Butch Parrish. I live down in Swainsboro, represent District 156. That's Johnson, Emmanuel, Candler, and part of Bullitt County. I'm glad to be with you.
And good evening. My name is David Knight. I'm the representative from District 126, and that is parts of Spalding, Butts, and Lamar County, about an hour below Atlanta.
Good afternoon. My name is Chuck Martin. I represent the 47th District, which is made up of Greater North Fulton County, Alpharetta and Roswell, and soon to be the cities of Johns Creek and Milton. I appreciate you guys taking the time to be here with us today, and we look forward to what you have to say.
All right, as you can tell, we have a full agenda today, and we're going to try to keep things hopping and moving right along. And our first person on the agenda, our first presenter, if we would just ask the presenters if you would to step forward and stand behind the podium here. And remember that you're addressing the members as well as the folks in the audience. If you need a PowerPoint presentation, Ward Lamb, to my right, your left, behind us here, we'll be glad to help you get set up and you can plug in. It would help us if we keep things moving. If you have a presentation that you need to do, if you'll get that prepared so that we can just move right along. And we'll get started. Our first presentation comes from Dr. Carolyn Bordeaux, who's Assistant Professor of Public Administration and Urban Studies at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University. And we'll call on Dr. Bordeaux at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, so I'm going to roll with this without the PowerPoints because I know you guys don't have much time, but we'll be coming out with a brief report on budget reserves through the Fiscal Research Center. And I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights, and I'm happy to answer questions later if you have any. Right now, the way the Georgia State Code stands is the state has to establish and maintain a revenue shortfall reserve in an amount equal to 4% of the net revenues from the previous year. This amount is capped at 10% of the previous year's net revenue. There should be, yeah, you've got my PowerPoint slides. Okay. What I did to look at this reserve was to first compare it to other states that have AAA bond ratings, and then to look at the previous downturns that the state faced and how much it would need to have on reserve in order to keep revenues level. Okay, so perhaps the most conservative way of looking at it, assuming that there is no increase, you all didn't project any kind of increase in your revenues or expenditures for the coming year. Just to flip through it, in the comparison to other states, I looked at Delaware, Maryland, Minnesota, Missouri, Virginia, Utah, and compared all of them. They have on average about a 5% reserve set aside. States like Virginia have a 10% cap, very similar to Georgia. A couple states have a cap of 5% on their revenue shortfall reserve. Georgia is basically right in keeping with those other states in terms of its policy. Right now it's a little bit low in terms of what it actually has on hand, but I understand that in fiscal year 06, a good chunk of money will be put into the revenue shortfall reserve. I also looked at some of the recommended best practices. The Government Finance Officers Association recommends between 5 and 15% of net revenues on reserve. National Conference of State Legislators, 5% of net expenditures. And a lot of research supports the idea that sort of between 5 and 15% is about what you need to cover you for that first shock that you're likely to face if something goes awry in the economy. Unfortunately, to cover to keep things level for more than 1 year, you often need between like 10 and 50% of your net revenues to keep expenditures and revenues level over a couple years, which is beyond what most states are willing to hold. Looking at the two big downturns that the state has faced over the past 20 years, really, you have one in 1991, 92, and then you have one in 2002, 2003, which is the really big one that the state just came through. Looking at the downturn in 91, 92, you had revenues decrease by 2% and then by 1% in each year in real dollars. Assuming that the state in 1991 had not projected any growth, okay, so they didn't go out there and spend budget based on a projected increase in revenues, the state would have needed a 6% reserve based on 1990 net revenues. They would have needed to set aside 6% in order to keep revenues flat. Okay? If they had projected an increase, say 6%, which is the historic average increase in Georgia, they would have needed to have had about a 20% reserve on hand. Okay? So when I'm talking about flat, I'm keeping it at a very conservative and perhaps even unlikely low number. In 2002 and 03, of course, this was a tremendous downturn. A lot of other states compared it to the worst downturn since World War II. Revenues decreased by 7% in 2002, 7% again in 2003 in real dollars. Okay, so I'm taking into account inflation there. It also turned down in actual dollars, as many of you know. In order to keep revenues constant, expenditures constant for 2002, the state would have needed an 8% reserve in 2001 net revenues. Fortuitously, the state did have that on hand. Over the entire 2002-05 period, the state would have needed about 45% of net revenues in order to keep everything flat. In 2001, the state had reserves, and it had a substantial surplus on hand, equal to about 12% of net revenues. What this did meant that in 2002, you probably didn't feel this sudden downturn very dramatically, and then in 2003, the state had a softer landing than it might have otherwise, even though it did have to make some pretty significant cuts. Interestingly, in real terms, the state has not recovered entirely. In real dollars, the state is still, I believe as of 2005, was still below 2001 in terms of real net revenues coming in. One other thing that I looked at just in brief was cash flow and the extent to which the state needs to have some sort of buffer on hand during the year as the revenues fluctuate throughout the year. In general, Georgia has always been fairly good in terms of having sufficient cash on hand. Unlike a lot of other states, it has not had to issue tax anticipation notes. So it seems like the state is fairly safe with regard to having enough of a buffer during the fiscal year. In general, Georgia's policy seems to be in line with other states, slightly lower, and generally it's in line with the existing best practices. In terms of its policy, it would need to refill its revenue shortfall reserve sum in order to keep up with other states that are AAA bond rated. And one thing it might want to consider in order to really be in line with something like a Government Finance Officers Association recommendation is setting a 5% minimum, and then the 10% maximum seems to be okay. That's it? You're not doing questions or?
Well, Dr. Badeau, thank you for that presentation. Any members have any questions that you'd like to ask? The reserve is a very important subject, so any questions from any members? All right, Dr.
Okay.
Bordeaux, you did very well. Thank you.
Kept it short. Thanks a lot.
At this time, our next presenter will be Dr. Sally Wallace, who's Professor of Economics and Associate Director at the Fiscal Research Center, the Andrew Young Policy Studies at Georgia State University. And if you have a handout, it will help us, if you're a presenter, if you'll let us know your handout, the title, maybe hold it up so we can see. We have a number here, and that'll help us to refer to it as you speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us. The handout that I'm going to speak to has a title of Number of Local Governments and Sales Tax Exemptions, titled by Dave Shoquist and myself. What I was charged to do with today are two things. First, to sort of very briefly talk about the number of local governments in Georgia. I understand that a question or an issue came up at one of the previous meetings regarding whether or not, if Georgia consolidated the number of local governments, whether that would be any saving in terms of expenditures in the public sector. And then secondly, sort of disjointly, the issue of sales tax exemptions, which was flashed very nicely on the front cover of AJC this morning. So first I'll talk briefly about the issue of the number of local governments. Georgia is popularly known to be one of the states with the most number of county governments. Georgia, with 159 counties, is a fairly large number across states. Texas is the only state with more county governments at 254. Delaware, the small state of Delaware, has 3 counties, so those are the extremes there. As you all certainly know, those absolute comparisons are not all that useful without taking into consideration what different local governments do, the size of states, the area that are covered by states. So what we did, and goes to the third page of the PowerPoint, table number 1 looks at the number of local governments along a couple of different strata. And when we look at overall local governments, not just counties, but overall local governments, Georgia posts 1,047 local governments, which ranks at 21st among the 50 states. So no longer at the high end of the spectrum, but sort of right in the middle of the range of what states do for local government. Illinois has nearly 5 times as many local governments. It has a total of 4,692, and Hawaii has the smallest number of local governments with 6 local governments. Again, comparing pure numbers, absolute numbers like that is a little bit of apples and orange comparison. So we took, in the next 3 slides, where you'll see the graphs, we looked at the number of local governments relative to some other demographics, which is the population size and also the land area. Georgia ranks 37 in terms of the number of local governments. If we look at local governments per 100,000 of the population, so we're at the lower end when we sort of control for the size of our population. And we rank 28th in terms of number of local governments when we do it by square miles, per 1,000 square miles. The big question, the policy question that came to us was whether or not the number of local governments had much correlation with the level of expenditures. So the graphs on page 4, 5, and 6 in the handout are very simple correlations of the number of local governments and the expenditures per capita for all states. And if you just look at those graphs, if we thought that there was a relationship, we should see a very strong line either up an angle or down an angle. And what we noticed, and when we look statistically, is that there's not a significant relationship between the number of local governments and the expenditures per capita when we control for population size or land area. What does that mean? Does it mean that there is any relationship between local government spending and the number of local governments? Really difficult to ascertain from the evidence that we see. Large part of the problem is that each state and each local government presents a different market basket to their constituents. So you have the apples and oranges problem where local governments are producing different types of public goods. The evidence, empirical evidence that's been done is strongest for school districts, in part because they provide something that's a little bit more homogeneous, more similar. And the empirical evidence does seem pretty strong to say that the cost, sort of the economies of scale for school systems comes at school system sizes of between 2,000 and 4,000 students. So school systems that are quite a bit smaller than that and school systems that are larger than that are hitting the diseconomies of scale. 2,000 to 4,000 numbers of students per school system seems to be empirically kind of the optimal in terms of government expenditures on schools. In Georgia, we have, we counted up 50 systems with less than 2,000 students and 12 systems with less than 1,000 students. So we do have a number of school systems that are in the lower end of that range. And we do also have some school systems above or close to 4,000, particularly in the metro area in Gwinnett County. So, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, I'll jump to the sales tax. Is that?
That'd be great.
The remainder of the presentation is on sales tax expenditures. As we all know, sales tax is one of our largest revenue producers, both for the state government and for local governments in Georgia. In fiscal year 05, it brought in for the state $5.2 billion of revenue, making it one of the top producers. 34.3% of total state government tax revenue came in the way of sales tax. Georgia, like many states, has a number of exemptions in the sales tax system. Georgia's tax code is written both specifically and generally. Retail goods, sales at retail are typically taxed unless specifically exempted. Services in the Georgia code are typically exempted unless specifically taxed. So we have slight difference in the language for retail consumption versus service kinds of consumption. The sales tax exemptions in Georgia, as well as other states, are made for many different reasons. They're made for equity reasons, for charity purposes, nonprofit corporate companies, for purposes of economic development. Some examples include food, prescription drugs, sales tax exemptions for particular industries. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy on the pros and cons of exemptions. On the positive side, they're thought to bring in an aspect of equity, for instance, with the food exemption, or they may help economic development. On the other hand, they can be difficult to deal with in terms of tax administration. Sometimes we're left with smaller companies making the decision, making sure that they catch what's tax exempt and what's not tax exempt. In Georgia, the sales tax exemptions have grown over time, and currently the foregone revenue value of the sales tax exemption, this is in FY04 numbers that we did, is $9.8 billion. So if we wiped out every sales tax exemption, the good ones and the bad ones, it would increase sales tax revenue in 2004 by $9.8 billion. So in 2004, again, if we had wiped out all of those exemptions, sales tax revenue would have been $14.7 billion. More than double, obviously, what we currently have. Now, if we wanted to wipe out those exemptions but keep our sales tax and not raise any more revenue, so keep revenue neutral, that would suggest that we could lower the state sales tax rate from 4% to 1.33%. So for the trade-off there that we might do. In the report to the committee, Ward also handed out a recent report that documents the sales tax. I'm not going to go through, but there's a table 1 in the report that begins on page 3, And it documents the revenue loss from each individual sales tax exemption. And just to highlight for everyone, the largest exemptions are for food, the credit allowance for trade-ins, vehicle trade-ins and others, prescription drugs, repair services, government sales, sales of raw material used in manufacturing. Those are very large tax expenditures. Some of the very specific tax expenditures that are in this estimate include the sales tax holiday, the sales tax exemption for the film production and digital broadcasting industry, and sod grass. And I just picked those out as examples of some that are in this table. With respect to the sales tax exemptions, again, there are justifications for many of them. In order to remain competitive, to be equitable, many of them have positive justifications. One of the biggest issues to consider or to worry about is whether those continue to be relevant in today's economy and what the implications are for tax administration by having these exemptions in the system. That's the end of my remarks, and I'm happy to respond to questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace. Any questions from members of the committee? Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand. Your numbers indicate that in '04, I guess it is, or '05, that if we had no exemptions in our code, we would have collected 2 times again what we did?
Close to 2 times as much.
So with no exemptions, our revenues from sales tax then would be about
15 billion.
And that was for '05?
04. FY 04.
Okay. Now, are you pretty sure about those numbers? I mean,
But we think that they're done to the best of the ability for the numbers that we can estimate. You'll notice in the table that some of them we don't think that we have good numbers for, so those are not in the bottom line. So in Table 1, there's some that we don't have estimates for. So we're I think in general we do this kind of work fairly conservatively.
All right, Mr. Richard Royal.
First question, Dr. Wallace, you're not suggesting that we consolidate all the counties now, are you?
No.
Good. Second question, have you done any comparison on how much, if all the sales tax exemptions were gone, how much that would reduce the personal income tax if you applied it to that rather than the sales tax?
We didn't do that specifically, but for instance, if we wiped out all of the exemptions, it would take over the income tax. You would more than offset a full reduction in the income tax.
Representative Martin, you have a question?
I have a question, and I know we don't have time to drill down on all these exemptions. I just want to try to understand.
Sure.
Particularly the credit for trade-ins. One purchases a car for $10 or $10,000, and you pay sales tax on that new car or that used car purchased from the dealer. If 5 years later one trades that car in and gets a $5,000 value and buys another $10,000 car, then you only pay tax on
the difference.
On the difference. So we're considering the trade-in being an exemption, but in fact that's already been that car has already been taxed. And I just try to look at any other places in our economy where Georgians are expected to pay sales tax on something twice.
Yeah, that's the right interpretation for that, and it's by our understanding of the tax code, that's considered an exemption. But as I mentioned, not all exemptions are inappropriate or
But if we weren't careful about that, then when people come to, and I know food's already exempt,
right,
for instance, but I'll use this as an example. If it weren't, then we would end up in a place where we could actually be charging people a sales tax on something that they have a coupon for, or something that they're giving a value and getting for free. It would be a similar situation.
right.
Okay. I just want to make sure I understand what we're doing. I'm sorry. Can I follow up on Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Tell me about, under B, also here, personal property brought into Georgia. I mean, that's not necessarily exempted. Is there not supposed to be? I mean, technically, Georgians should be paying a use tax on that property, should they not? I mean, those aren't exemptions. Those are just personal property purchased outside the state and brought in is in fact subject to tax. It's just we probably don't have a manner by which to collect that.
I'm sorry, which one are you on?
It's in exemption A, it's about 5 or 6 down.
Oh, okay.
Personal property brought into Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if property, if some furniture is purchased in North Carolina and brought into Georgia, they're not taxed in North Carolina because you're a
Right.
Georgia resident. Technically, one should pay
A use tax.
So that's not really an exemption, that's just failure to capture a use tax, is it?
Yeah, I have to admit, I would need to look a little bit more specifically into a particular one like that,
Okay.
because it should be listed as an exemption if it's covered under the use tax.
Chairman O'Neill? You have any?
Yeah, out of all these, and I assume you had a chance to look at them all since you compiled them, from the standpoint of obsolescence, or basically being antiquated from the initial purpose, whether it be charitable or economic development or whatever might have been the purpose of it. Are there 2 or 3 you could tell us about that maybe shouldn't be around anymore, or we should be looking at as far as the efficacy of them in the code?
Specifically with this list, I mean,
Like the honeybees, I can see that pretty quick.
yeah. In instance, it's a fairly small item, the sale of sod grass. I don't know how long that one in particular has been along. If it's installation in an industrial property, then there would be reason to consider an exemption for it. If it has a history of some other basis that may be antiquated, that could be one. The big ticket items on here are issues, again, like food for home consumption, which is not necessarily obsolescent, but changes the buoyancy or the natural growth in the sales tax. But it's not under the category of obsolescence.
One last follow-up question. It's been said by many that exemptions actually just spread taxation to other areas. Walk me through that, because what I'm hearing from you is that we lose $9-point-something billion of revenue from the exemptions, but I don't see how any of these exemptions cost in other areas. How does that? Is that with the assumption that we have to raise so much by?
I think it's with the assumption that if we want to get a certain revenue basket, then we're going to be taking it from different baskets. And if you don't take it from the sales tax, you're going to take it from another type of tax, which may or may not be a better tax for Georgia. If it's coming at a tax that has a bigger impact on economic development, then it may be more costly to Georgia in the long term.
Yes, sir, Representative Roy.
Dr. Wallace, you may have answered this when Representative Martin asked you the question, but this on these trade-ins for automobiles especially, those trade-ins are ultimately sold and taxes are collected on those. Has that been taken in consideration on these numbers?
I'm sorry, which part?
The used car trade-ins.
Uh-huh.
When those cars are sold, sales tax is collected on them. So are these numbers adjusted for the?
That should be the net of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could I ask a
Representative
question? Dr. Wallace, let me ask you a question, and it's sort of an exemption because I guess we don't know what to do with it, but what impact would this have on our sales tax if we knew what to do about internet sales and tax on that?
It's a large question. The estimates for the impact of internet sales on Georgia, I think the numbers that we're seeing now are that the impact, if we could tax internet sales, is around 5% of revenue currently. The concern is that has continued to grow. It sounds small, but it's come up from, it was about 1.5% a couple years ago when we were looking at it. One of the big concerns being in the business-to-business trading on the internet and the impact that has. So, in absolute terms, it's not as large as some of these numbers now, but the concern is long-term.
What sort of growth rate do you see for that, or are you able to determine that?
It's subject to an awful lot of speculation. I mean, some of the numbers that we have seen show a growth rate of 5 to 6% per year. Others are much more conservative, but then you hear people talking about 15% per year. I think that's probably unrealistic that it would be that large.
Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Wallace, thank you. I'd like to ask you one question if I could, and that would be, I think it would be real productive, at least for me, and I think the other members would like as well, if we could have maybe a list, all these exemptions that are listed here, of ones that through your studies you would recommend we do take a look at.
Like Chairman O'Neill was
That's
speaking
right.
of.
But I think a list would be helpful. And thank you. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. It's great information.
We have another representative that slipped in, and I failed to mention Representative Ron Stevens is with us today. He's also on the Ways and Means Committee. And Representative Carl Rogers, who represents Hall County. Will both of you stand up? There's Carl in the back, and Representative Stevens. We're glad to have you all with us. All right. Our next presentation is by Alan Essage. He's the Executive Director of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. And so if you would come at this time and share your remarks. Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The presentation is Comprehensive Tax Reform, a focus on fairness. That should be in your packet. I guess what I want to talk, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute issued a report about 3 or 4 weeks ago, trying to show what an example of comprehensive tax reform could look like. The example, there were examples. They weren't the best way to do it, or the only way to do it, or the right way to do it, but just to kind of show taking all sorts of different taxes into consideration, tax cuts, tax increases, how that would affect the system. One of the things that we try to look at, and that we hope you all try to look at as you look through the system, is linking taxes to the budget. It's really important to understand what the budget looks like, what's driving the budget, because as you're developing a tax system to raise revenues, you have to have some sense of how much revenues you need and then how to raise them fairly. One thing to remember is 85% of the state budget is education, healthcare, health and social services, and criminal justice. And that's a real important number, because if you're at a point where you're short money, if you go through a recession, or if you end up doing a large amount of tax cuts in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if you're short, the places you end up hitting are education and healthcare, because that's where the money is. If you take out education, healthcare, health human services, criminal justice, transportation, debt service, and the tax cut we have appropriated in the budget, which is the homeowners tax relief credit, all the rest of the state agencies are less than 4% of the budget. So you could basically wipe out the entire state bureaucracy, fire thousands of people, and save about $600 to $700 million. So if you're in a situation like we were 3 or 4 years ago in the recession, and we were short up to over $1 billion, that's why education and Medicaid were hit, because you can't just wipe out the entire bureaucracy. And I think it's an important concept to understand. Georgia is the 9th largest and 5th fastest growing state, and again, that's what generally drives the budget. Population state government serves grow faster than the overall population. Overall population growth from 1990 to 2005 was about 40%. Medicaid grew about 126% during that time, and the prison population grew about 153% during that time. And looking at the adequacy of funds, if you look at the amount of revenues Georgians pay, the amount of revenues Georgians pay compared to their income, we're actually at about a 25-year low. We were consistently about 6%, returned about on a per capita basis, about 6% of Georgians' income went to support state government. That, at the height of the recession, that dropped to about 5.4%. It's gone up through 2005 to about 5.6, which is still about almost 0.5% less than it has been historically. That 0.4 of a point equals about $1 billion. So if we were collecting revenues at the same rate that we've been collecting between 1980 and 2001, the budget would be about $1 billion bigger than it is today. Another thing, again, we're looking at the tax system as a whole. It's a question of whether the tax system is aggressive, progressive, or proportional. A progressive tax system means those who make more pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes. A proportional system makes it's generally even between those who make the low income and the high income. And a regressive system means that the lower income pays a higher percentage of their income in taxes. Georgia, with state and local taxes, has a regressive system. The lower income pay a larger percentage of their income than the higher. Now, it doesn't mean, and this is sometimes misunderstood, you can have a millionaire who pay more in taxes than someone who makes $20,000 actually earns. So it's not that they're not paying more dollar amount, but the percentage of their income, they'll pay less than someone making $20,000 on average. It's also important to look at the tax system of whether fairness of those within the same income group, or they're paying the same as somebody else. And the biggest example of this is between seniors and non-seniors. This is based on 2002 data. Seniors overall pay about have an effective tax rate of about 1%, and non-seniors is about 2.5%. That would even be more of a gap today because the 2002 numbers did not include the income exclusion increasing to $35,000 by 2008. So you have a situation where someone making the same income but based on age ends up paying less in taxes than another person. There are several, principles that we would hope that we would look at when we're talking about modernizing the tax system. I mean, one is improving the fairness between people with similar incomes and people with different incomes, protecting the adequacy of funds by ensuring the tax base reflects the 21st century economy, and that any tax cuts are coupled with offsetting tax increases. And again, that's important for looking at what the budget needs are, not just now, but what the needs are going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now. Several tax reform options with the income tax. You can give tax cuts by broadening the tax brackets. You can offset that by creating a new rate. If you created a new 7% rate, you could pay for broadening the brackets, adjusting the standard deductions and personal exemptions for inflation, creating a refundable earned income tax credit, which is basically modeled after the federal earned income tax credit. The state portion of that could be a percentage, either 5, 10, 20% of what the federal earned income tax credit is. And that's a tax credit that is geared towards those working, poor, moderate income who generally make less than $30,000 a year. In the sales tax, one of the things I was just talked about is rethinking sales tax exemptions. And I think it's something that, a reform that won't cost a dime is, and I think would answer a lot of the questions you all had based on the last presentation, was implementing a tax expenditure report. About 35 other states have a tax expenditure report. And what it is it's part of the budget where all the tax exemptions, including sales tax and income tax dealing with business tax credits, would be listed out as all the budget expenditures are listed out. So what you end up getting is a report similar to what Georgia State did, except produced by either OPB or the Audit Office or Department of Audits, and made part of the budget. And that would give the General Assembly the option to make choices. If there's a tax exemption A that's costing the state $500,000 and a budget need that might cost the state $500,000, right now you have no idea on the tax end what options are out there. A tax expenditure report would give you a menu and allow you to make those kind of choices. What some states do also, taking it one step further, and in some tax exemptions it's appropriate and some it's not, because some are not really there for policy reasons and some are, is having some kind of evaluation or outcomes. Business tax credits, I think, are a good example of that. If you had part of the tax expenditure report, how much each business tax credit is costing, and then also outcome measures on whether they're serving the policy purpose that they were put in for, again, it will give you information to make decisions. Because clearly not all tax exemptions, whether it's sales or income, are bad. Some are very proper policy, very proper politically, and make sense economic development-wise. It's allowing you to have the information to make that decision for yourself on whether it's serving the purpose. Another thing you can do is expanding the sales tax base to services. And if you do that, you could actually lower the sales tax rate. If all discounting business-to-business services, if all household services were covered under the sales tax, you could actually lower the sales tax rate from 4% to 3.5%. And also increasing the cigarette taxes. This is one that it's less than tax policy reasons than health policy reasons. The single best Medicaid reform, health policy reform, I think the state could do, is by stopping 16-year-olds today from smoking. 20, 30, 40 years from now, that would have a bigger impact on the Medicaid budget than just about anything else we're doing. So if raising the price of cigarettes will prevent teens from taking up smoking, it has a long-term budget impact. In the short term, obviously, it has a revenue impact. I think it's estimated a $1 increase in the cigarette tax would raise about $500 million. One of the things we talk about is the importance of not if you were to do something like that, of not budgeting all $500 million. Because if the tax works the way you want it to for public policy purposes, smoking should decrease over time. So therefore, the revenues theoretically will decrease over time. So what you want to do is actually underestimate the revenue estimate on that. And our recommendation would be to put that money in the reserves. For instance, if you raised it by $1 and you estimated it would raise $500 million, you only budget $350 million of it. At the end of the year, you'd have a $150 million surplus, which could be placed in the reserve accounts. Property taxes is another reform. I mean, it's a very controversial subject. Is you can create a property tax circuit breaker, which basically holds property taxes to a certain percent of income. And this reform could be revenue neutral if you were to substitute the circuit breaker for the homeowner's tax relief credit. The homeowner's tax relief credit is about $434 million. And the price of a circuit breaker would be totally dependent on what level of income you do it at, what percentage that you have. But that's a way of helping out low and moderate income folks and guaranteeing that their property tax will not raise above a certain percentage of income. And then corporate income tax, I mean, something I think that the chairman led the way on is Georgia closed one of the biggest corporate loopholes a couple of years ago, the Delaware Holding Company loophole. There are two smaller loopholes, corporate loopholes, that could be closed, that could raise, and I'm sure we have a solid estimate on how much, but it could raise X amount of dollars if we did that. Another thing, I mean, and this was a change that was actually made from the feds that the General Assembly actually didn't ever vote one way or the other on, although I think it's clear which way the vote would go. And that's the estate tax. About 24 states have retained the estate tax revenue by either decoupling from the federal code or by levying a state estate tax. Georgia did not decouple from the feds, so basically our estate tax has gone away. If we were to bring that back, it would bring in about $150 million. If you look at the last two charts, this gives you examples. I mean, two examples of, again, what comprehensive tax reform could look like. Again, this is not a recommendation. This is not saying this is the best or the only. I mean, the possibilities are literally endless. But if you, I mean, important concept, I think, there are, and I know Representative Royal very good-naturedly always kids me, is there any tax cut that I would support? Because I spend a lot of time in the Ways and Means Committee arguing against tax cuts. And these are examples of, there are lots of tax cuts built in here, but they're paid for with other revenue, because there's no free lunch. If you give tax cut A, B, C, D, and E, the bottom line is the state's going to lose $500, $600, $700, $800 million unless somehow you make up the revenue some other way. So these are examples of reforming the income tax system, which actually would overall be a tax cut, broadening the sales tax base and actually reducing the sales tax rate, but then you increase the cigarette taxes and decouple the federal estate tax, and you have a higher income tax rate, you could end up paying for it. And example A actually gives, again, it raises $245 million, but again, our recommendation would be that would end up being put in the reserves. But in that recommendation, the bottom 85% of taxpayers would receive a tax cut. In example B, the bottom 95% of taxpayers would have a tax cut. So it is, if you look at it comprehensively, and if you look at how to replace revenues with the targeted cuts that you think are necessary, it is possible to retain revenues. It is possible even to increase revenues and still give a large majority of Georgians tax relief.
All right. Any questions from members of the committee? Thank you for your presentation. Our next Representative Rogers, if you'd like to come sit with us, you certainly may. There's an extra seat up here. If you'd like to remain where you are, that's fine as well, but you're welcome. At this time, I'm going to depart from the agenda just for a second and want to ask Tommy Hills, who is Chief Financial Officer in the Governor's office, if he would like to come and share for a moment.
Thank you, Representative Mills and committee members and other guests. Just some general comments, mostly about reserves, but I will make a couple of other comments. In the form of the tax spending that Dr. Essick had talked about, I just would know from an information standpoint that the Office of Ways and Means in the House and the Office of Planning and Budget, the Revenue Department, for the last couple of years have been putting that list together on an annual basis and looking at those tax cuts. So we've got maybe 3 years, I guess, Michelle, where you, in terms of those things we've been recording, that speak somewhat to the point that Alan was making. And that is information available in terms of looking at it. The way it's been taken into account each year as far as after the fact is as we have the state economists prepare the revenue estimate is a deduction from the revenue estimate for those new reductions in income tax or sales tax or whatever tax was reduced. So we are trying to pay some attention to that. Not exactly the point you're making, Alan, that there is an information base on that. I want to talk a bit about reserves and really somewhat of a follow-up to what Dr. Bordeaux talked about. I think as you may know, or some of you may know, that we made two primary changes to the reserve law in 2005 by raising the max cap on that reserve fund from 5% to 10%. We combined what was the mid-year adjustment reserve with the revenue shortfall reserve, still allowing the first up to 1% to come out for public education growth. It used to be able to be used for other things other than public education growth if the public education growth wasn't up to 1%. So now it's limited somewhat there. And then raised the max on which you couldn't appropriate from 3% to 4%. Dr. Bordeaux makes a point of raising it 5%. I think we're looking at kind of a gradual thing. I think certainly wouldn't object to that level of need. What really happened from a reality standpoint is Dr. Bordeaux referenced is that I looked at the not real dollar but the actual dollar percentages that she looked at, and I think we were something like 5% reduction in revenue in 2002 and 2.5% in 2003. And had we not had those reserves at the level we did, that at the close to 12% level that Dr. Bordeaux referenced, we would have been in really bad shape. I mean, we would have, you just can't turn the battleship in the middle of the creek that quickly to reduce your expenditures when you don't know that your revenue is going to be reduced to the extent it was. I started with the governor's office in early June of 2003, just after y'all broke up the legislative session that year, I think. And the state economist was still sticking by his prediction. We had a mid-June conversation with the bond rating agencies because we were in the process of selling some bonds at that time, and he was still thinking that we were going to not go down 2.5% that year, but go down something like 1%. So we were unfortunately determined that we did have that shortfall, and that that amounted to a couple $100 million more in less in revenue than we thought we had. That budget had appropriated some dollars from the revenue shortfall reserve when we thought there was an excess in it, and when we ended up short, we actually didn't have that excess, but we already appropriated some money, so we ended up taking the reserves down to a net of $50 million at the end of fiscal year 2003 after the mid-year adjustment had been paid out. And that was just dangerous. That's less than a day's worth of revenue for the state government. And where that came into play next year was that in 2004, because we didn't make the revenue estimate when we thought we would in 2003, the percentage growth we had attained in 2004 was higher than what was realistic. The number had already been set. And so, as you remember, we cut the revenue estimate a couple times during that General Assembly session, which turned out to be accurate. We did not know we made the budget until the very last day of the year. That June 30th of that year, I think we got in something like $80 million in revenue, and we wouldn't have made the budget if we hadn't gotten that much revenue in that last day. So we were that close with $50 million in reserves. If it been a lesser month, we would have gone down to about zero in reserves. So we do know, having 2 years in succession and having recession, where we went down 7.5%, 8% in budget on the budgeted revenue, that you do need to have a base there. Otherwise, you're just playing a dangerous game, and you'd have to make decisions of laying people off at the last month of the year and things like that. That obviously are not a good management technique. comment about the reserves. I think I've sat now with bond rating agencies, and I think it's about 36 times since I've been here. We generally meet them, 36 times because they're three agencies. We generally meet with them 4 times a year for bond issues, and then one general session where we just try to sell the financial strength of the state. And so what I hear, I'm not the quickest thing in the world, but after 36 times to listen to people, you do pick up some general trends about what they think is important. And the level of reserves is certainly one of those top 4 or 5 items that the external rating worlds are looking at in terms of how they rate Georgia as a AAA state and the credibility that we have as a strong financial organization. Other factors that are very important are the relative growth rate of our revenue, our economy, relative to the rest of the country. I think that the only thing that was a fail-safe for us in the 2002 and 2003 downturn is that the other states had the same problem, and so relatively we didn't look any worse, really much worse than anybody else. We were a little bit slower coming back, but so relative economic position. They also favor people who have balanced sources of revenue, that you don't get all your revenue from one source. So if you've got an array of different primary tax sources like sales tax, corporate income tax, individual income tax, motor fuel taxes, that you're better able to buffer vagaries in the economy than if you just relied on 1 or 2 sources. Financial reporting is another factor, obviously, and then practice, whether you have conservative financial practices or not, are also very important. I would like to comment, basically go to, not so much from a rating agency standpoint, but the way that the economic development folks rate us. And this is a little bit in difference of agreement with Dr. Essig on this, but though some states do have graduated corporate and personal income tax rates, those people who rate states on attractiveness of economic development rate us very highly because we don't have graduated rates. So part of bringing new business into Georgia is the fact that our personal income tax and our corporate income tax are not indexed on a sliding scale based on amount. The reason for reserves, one other factor, the Director Board referenced this too from a cash flow standpoint. We actually did, December 15th, 2003, get down to where we weren't sure we had enough money in the Treasury. That was the time where in that month, you prepay salaries for the regents in early December because they're off in December, and their allotment gets up, and you don't get the big revenues until January. And we were very, very close to not thinking we might not have enough money. Fortunately, we did. Enough revenue came in that month that we were okay, but it was very, very close. And so it just goes to the point of making sure that we do have adequate reserves. And the process we went through in determining that we should raise the max level of those reserves and the minimum level by 1 percentage point was talking to our financial advisor firm in New York that guides us on bond issues and financial management. And they did look at the other, just like Dr. Bordeaux referenced, the other AAA rated states, and came up to that 5 to 10% range as being the most prudent level that we look at. So I urge us to kind of keep that in mind as we look at its different tax changes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tommy, any questions from any members of the committee? Chairman O'Neill?
Tommy, that's a pretty big range, 5 to 10% in the scope of all that. 4%, as I understand, it's less than 2 weeks. We ask our local governments, as a matter of fiscal oversight, to budget reserves in the neighborhood of 3 months. Why do we feel like that 5 to 10% is adequate?
Well, I guess the answer to the question is it's a delicate balance, as we all know. I think that you want to make sure that you're not building too much reserves because people get antsy, you're overcharging on taxes. And so I think there's a gradual ramp up. When I said that we went up from 3 to 4%, and certainly thinking going up to a minimum 5% would be reasonable. Over time, I could see us going up a little bit, moving into that gradation of a higher level of reserve, because I do think it's prudent to have it higher than 4 or 5%. I mean, we know we can go through 4% in 2 years because we did. So.
Representative Parrish.
Mr. Tibbs, let me ask you a question. From your conversations with the bond rating folks, and of course we've got a AAA bond rating, we're all proud of that. would it be fair to say that one thing that helps us maintain that is the fact that our tax system is based on is a broader base? By that, I mean income tax, sales tax, and other
Yes,
things.
definitely.
As opposed to maybe like Florida when the recession hit and all theirs is based on sales tax, and you saw what a dramatic downturn that had. So isn't that important from your conversations with the bonding agencies?
It's very, very important to have diverse sources of income with some balance in there. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Tommy.
Okay.
All right, our next presenter is one of our own, Representative Ron Stevens, who's here going to share with us, and he also has Barry White with him, who's chairman of the Tourism Development Alliance of Georgia, and also Joy Wallstrom is with us to make a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Ron Stevens. I'm the Chairman of Economic Development and Tourism for the Georgia House. I represent Savannah, Bryan County, and Liberty County, big chunks of it. I would like to give some accolades before I talk a little bit about the hotel motel tax and where I think it ought to go, and mostly a little bit of where we've come with the hotel motel tax. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, just so that you know where Georgia is economically, and even more important where their future is economically, the LAFLA report came out, which is an economist during the Reagan administration, who said that Georgia's economic future is rated #1 in the country for future economic development. So with the hard work with the administration, and especially this particular group over a period of years, I just thought it would be appropriate that you know that. Georgia's laid down a track for economic development, eliminated many barriers to business, and a lot of it should go to Chairman O'Neill with the hard work of eliminating one of the biggest barriers in the single factor corporate tax. And deserves some accolades for that. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the hotel motel tax. My predecessor, Mickey Chenell, from, again, in North Georgia, in Oconee, came about trying to tighten up some of the hotel motel tax law that we've had over a period of years, and did a very good job of that. But we need to continue that effort. The hotel motel tax was initiated back in the early 1900s, and strangely enough, the city of Detroit, as they were losing a lot of their convention areas, they decided to impose their own tax on themselves, that is a fee on themselves, before it became a real tax. The purpose for that tax was nothing more, nothing less than to promote themselves, to get tourism and to get those conventions back to the city of Detroit, and it worked. In Georgia, we started ours about mid-1970s, and currently we have about 23 versions of the hotel motel tax. Over 200 taxing districts are involved. Over 5 agencies, at least 5 agencies touch the hotel motel tax in either its collection, implementation, policing, which is our cities and counties, GMA, ACCG, DCA, the Department of Community Affairs, Department of Economic Development, and of course the Department of Revenue. So as you might imagine, with all of these 23 different versions of the tax, there is still some confusion. And it would be safe to say that there's probably a considerable amount of collecting tax, or even worse, spending the tax that's collected inappropriately. That essentially is the overview. But I would like to point out that as we tighten up this hotel motel tax, like everything else, as this committee knows, it's like a domino effect, because as we collect the hotel motel tax, as we self-promote tourism, and in Savannah it's the #1 industry, it also has an effect on other taxes that are also beneficial. The local option sales tax, which is your 5th sales tax penny. Around the state, as the hotel motel tax promotes, it also generates the SPLOS, the special purpose local option sales tax, not to mention the counties that have a special education local option sales tax. As this money that's self-imposed on hoteliers to collect and promote in that area tourism, all of these taxes go up, which of course all of us knows eliminates the burden to property taxes, which is a nasty word to a lot of people, and probably the least liked tax of all. Before I go though, I'd like to, Dan Rowe, our Deputy Commissioner, was just in an automobile accident, and he was going to join us also, but he is not hurt. For those of you looking around with your mouth He's fine, and he'll just be late getting here. But I would like to introduce Barry White from Augusta, who will give you the intricacies of the bills. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Stevens and Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Just go into a little bit more detail about why this code needs to be simplified. Merely the fact that there are 23 versions speaks to that. Personally, I've had about 3 attorneys give me an opinion on this tax. I think I got back 8 opinions from those 3 attorneys.
Only 8?
Only 8. But I just want to let you know that the groups that Representative Stevens mentioned, the GMA, ACCG, the Department of Revenue, the DCA, and the tourism industry have been working together to come up with some points of agreement that need to be addressed as we look at this state code. A few of those that we need to, items that we need to clarify is, one is who is exempt from paying the tax. There seems to be some confusion right now on qualifying nonprofits or government entities. Some are exempt, some are not, and some don't know. We also need to clarify who, if any, is exempt from collecting the tax. There are certain innkeepers and campgrounds or lodges that currently are not collecting the tax, and there's some confusion about that. We also need to establish a process for what happens to the dedicated pennies for capital investment once the bonds are paid. There are some examples across the state where the tax that was originally started in the 70s is paying for a bond indebtedness on certain facilities. Those facilities may have lived through their life cycle, but the debt continues to be reissued and the funding continued to those facilities. The next is allowing for the recipient of the tax, the one who actually expends the funds once it's collected, it's allowing them to build a reserve. It's difficult for organizations such as the Convention and Visitors Bureau or a Chamber of Commerce to operate strategically without knowing or without the availability or possibility of establishing some reserves. The last item, which the groups have all agreed need to be clarified, is the language for the qualifying nonprofit or the recipient of the tax. Right now, it's a little confusing. Convention and Visitor Bureaus are in there. 501c6s listed in general, chambers of commerce, and then in those 23 code sections, many different types of organizations are identified to be qualified to expend the funds that are collected. So the process is being reviewed by these organizations. We're doing this together. We want to come back collectively with some recommendations, and we're exploring other items that are under consideration as we, again, strongly suggest that this code is simplified so that we can get it down to maybe 3 opinions from 3 attorneys.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
I'm a little concerned with your statement that there's an array of entities or organizations, if you will, that have the authority to appropriate these funds as they're collected. We promulgate the tax, but how do you feel about the accountability to the public? I know the municipal associations in many cases, they're subservient to the electorate, and they set up the community service, whatever you call it, there. But chambers of commerce and other organizations like that are maybe 501c3s or whatever, they're really not accountable to the public in any way. You wouldn't consider it a dangerous precedent to be having a tax and then turning it over to a non-accountable. Not that there's anything wrong with chambers of commerce, I love them, but entities that are not really accountable to the electorate.
Well, yes, and just in my opinion, I think that there does need to be accountability, and right now that is the responsibility of the local government to make sure that those funds, if they go to a Chamber of Commerce or a Convention and Visitors Bureau, that there is accountability. Many times there is not, but hopefully that could be strengthened in the new code.
Any other questions from any other members? Well, all right. Well, 23 different versions throughout the state of the hotel motel tax is quite a few. Thank you. All right. Our next presenter will be Steve Williams. who is Executive Vice President of Georgia Forestry Association, and also John Hopkins is joining him as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman O'Neill, members of the committee. We appreciate very much the opportunity to speak before you today. My name is Steve McWilliams. I serve as the Executive Vice President of the Georgia Forestry Association, as the Chairman said. Our association is the principal advocacy organization for Georgia's very diverse forestry community. Our membership is comprised of forest landowners, forest product businesses, pulp and paper mills, sawmills, consultants, loggers, anybody that has anything to do with or passion for forestry has a place in the Georgia Forestry Association. And together, all of those groups and individuals sustain one of the state's major economic drivers. I will be speaking off of the handout with the gold logo in the top right-hand corner. Should have been given to you before the meeting. I have with me today Mr. Joe Hopkins, who is a forest landowner himself in Charlton County, former president of the Georgia Forestry Association. Mr. Hopkins also serves on the Department of Community Affairs Board and was a member of the Governor's Advisory Council for the Georgia Land Conservation Partnership. He also currently serves as the legislative chairman for the Forest Landowners Association, which is a national advocacy group for forest landowners. Approximately 3,000 of FLA's 10,000 members are located here in Georgia. If you've identified the handout, I noticed in my looking over it before the meeting that in my final draft, I left off a few lines at the bottom. I will get the complete testimony to you following the meeting. In addition, there are a couple of addendums that describe briefly the conservation use program in Georgia and give you sort of a profile of Georgia forestry. I'll give those to you. I will not be going into those today for the sake of time and try to respect the time that the chairman has allocated to us today. But we're here essentially for two reasons. First, because we believe that in the long term, sustainability of our woodlands and working landscapes in the state depend heavily on a working relationship between public officials like yourselves, the forest business community, and private non-industrial landowners. Second, we believe that Georgia's 150-year-old ad valorem tax system is broken, that it is obsolete in ways that pose immediate and long-term threats to the state's forests, the economic, environmental, and social benefits that they provide for each one of us. Our ad valorem property tax system has really not changed a great deal since it was created well over a century ago to fund local governments and a few years later to fund public schools. But the same certainly cannot be said for the state of Georgia. Needless to say, the Georgia of 2006 differs greatly from the Georgia of 1852. For example, in the 19th century, land was a principal source of wealth and thus one of the few significant sources of tax revenue to fund government operations. Today, as you all know, we're witnessing a rapid, irreversible shift from a rural agrarian economy to one in which more of the wealth and influence is concentrated in urban centers and sprawling suburbia. Yet, local property taxes continue to place an inordinate burden on many of Georgia's rural property owners. This is manifested in a system of property taxes that tends, this may be somewhat of an oversimplification, but it paints the picture, that tends to tax forest land based on its highest and best use rather than on its actual or current use, and which fails to recognize all of the ecological services to a community and to the state, which also in their own right have economic value. The need to respond to this trend has been highlighted recently in a number of ways. First, the August 2004 report of the Governor's Advisory Council for the Georgia Land Conservation Partnership concluded that the existing ad valorem tax policy, and I quote, "The existing ad valorem tax policy is a disincentive for maintaining and conserving farms and forest lands." That same report recommended that the state should undertake and consider amending the funding mechanisms for local governments and school boards that would permit consideration of the current use method of ad valorem taxation. Second, and more recently, the Joint Future of Forestry Study Committee, chaired by Senator Ross Collison and Representative Lynn Smith, in its final report issued in December of 2005, recommended that there be further study of the tax system's impact, and I'm quoting, further study of the tax system's impact on forest landowners and the forest industry by examining Georgia's taxation system in its entirety. I certainly consider the work that you're doing as a major first step in that direction, and appreciate and value that. And then even more recently, in testimony earlier this summer before this very committee, the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia noted that agricultural and forest landowners pay significantly more in property taxes than they demand in services from local governments. And there are studies that have documented that, and it certainly backed that point up. Our dilemma in trying to address this issue with public policy officials over the past few years has not been that there's been much disagreement with our position, but that it has been difficult to convey an understanding of the problem that would be widespread enough to lead to a commitment to do a serious study of it. In the end, we're talking about more than tax policy here. We're really talking about the kind of Georgia we will leave to those who come after us. How green will it be? Once undeveloped land is gone, it will not reappear. We could discuss in much more detail economic and environmental consequences of maintaining a status quo in this area. But at this point, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask Mr. Hopkins to speak on this subject from the perspective of a landowner who lives with the problem every day.
Mr. Hopkins. Thank you. I have also provided some notes, and mine just has kind of not anything fancy at the top.
Okay.
Steve recognized that I've been on several committees, and I'm encouraged by the possibility that this committee is in a position to recommend some type of equitable remedy to the problem we have. To put it on a more personal basis, in the last 10 years, the ad valorem taxes on the property we have, our timberland, has tripled. During that same amount of time, of course, our fuel costs have gone up, our employee costs have gone up, and I have attached 2 graphs on there that was done by Timber Mart South that shows pine timber has actually decreased in value in the last 10 years. And these are actual dollars. These are not inflation adjusted. If you adjust them over that 10 years for inflation, it's a much more bleak picture than that graph actually shows. This is exactly the problem we have. As Steve mentioned, we know the huge positive environmental impact that our forest land provides for our state, particularly the greenhouse gases cleanup that it does. As we all know, plants bring in carbon dioxide, store the carbon, and release the oxygen that we breathe. So these lands provide a very valuable resource. They also purify billions of gallons of water, and I don't have to tell y'all what water resources mean to the state of Georgia. I'm sure you know much more about that than I do, and the problems with it. Our current ad valorem tax policy, however, creates an enormous disincentive for forest landowners in Georgia, and it seeks us to seek other less desirable uses for our property. The result is development, fragmentation of the large contiguous tracts, loss of wildlife management areas, which we had one we lost several years ago, and a state that will change its character over time. What can be done? For some large landowners and some large contiguous tracts, unfortunately, it's too late. They're gone. For many others, however, there's still time. To value land in its current use, as Mr. McWilliams stated, would be a tremendous step in the right direction. Possibly even better would be to open up the CUBA valuation to all forest landowners, because this would also add the protection of a 10-year covenant not to do anything with the property, as well as a system where it's valued statewide rather than valued by each local county. I found it interesting when I read in the paper not long ago that we were considering taking ad valorem taxes off of automobiles. First of all, I wasn't aware that was a problem, as we have identified this issue as a problem in the state of Georgia for a long time as far as timberland goes. But I also would like to see us have a tax policy that would maybe encourage less cars and more forest land rather than encourage cheaper operating cars and less timberland. The University of Georgia did a study to see if all forest land was put under CUVA regardless of ownership type or number of acres, and it was estimated that would cost the counties and schools between $25 and $50 million. This amount could easily be supplemented and then phased out over time as the digest of these counties increased. I mentioned a second policy in here. I won't go into it in the interest of time because I see I'm almost out, but it involves the fact that we lost capital gains tax treatment in the late 80s, and yet we're still required to capitalize our expenses. There's a certain amount of inequity in there that I certainly think needs addressing, and I addressed it in my written materials. No one y'all excuse me, my allergies have flared up pretty bad, and I'm struggling here. No one understands, I think, long-term investment any more than a forest landowner. Home Depot buys a hammer today, puts it on the shelf, shelves it tomorrow, rotates that stock maybe hundreds of times during the year on the same shelf space. A forest landowner plants a tree and waits 25 or 30 years before ever getting significant income from the tree. How many of you today are willing to put your money in an investment that you're going to have to wait 25 or 30 years before you ever get anything out of it? That's a long-term commitment. And that's what the forest landowners of this state are doing. In summary, I can't overemphasize the importance of addressing the tax problems facing forest landowners in Georgia, particularly ad valorem property taxes on forest land. I was encouraged about a year ago when it appeared that an effort was underway to create another method for funding education. It appears, however, that that issue has been put on the back burner for the current time. The problem has been identified and discussed in this state in depth. It's time to make some important decisions. Once a problem is identified, the decision to do nothing about the problem is yet still a decision. We have moved education out of last place in Georgia, fortunately, so let's move our antiquated system of taxing Georgia forest land out of last place. We're the only state in the southeast that taxes it without putting it in its current use. And that's been a penalty of owning forest land in Georgia. Decisions need to be made in this state as to whether or not we want to encourage forest land ownership or fragmentation and development of our forest land tracts. Again, I will be glad to answer any questions that you have. And I'd like to close by paraphrasing a quote that I wish I could claim I originated, however, I did not. And that is, do we want asphalt to be our final crop? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Any questions from any members?
Yes.
Representative Roy.
Did you say that the estimated revenue loss if you opened up CUVA to all landowners was $25 to $50 million?
This was a study done by the University of Georgia, yes, sir.
All right, any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. Thank you for that presentation. All right, our next presenter is Clint Mueller, who is with the ACCG, and we'll ask Clint to come at this time and share. After Clint makes his presentation, we'll take about an 8 to 10 minute break and then come back.
I stand between y'all and your break.
This is terrible.
It's a tough job.
Tough spot right there.
Thank you, Chairman Mills, members of the committee. We appreciate you, again, allowing us to speak before this committee. We've already spoken on several issues, but at the first meeting, one issue that we mentioned was the different fees that we collect, or at least our constitutional officers collect, and whether those fees have been kept up to date to reflect true market costs for providing certain services. And we've come back, we did some research over the past couple months, and you've got a Excel spreadsheet in front of you, and I'm going to refer to that. But we've looked at all the different types of fees that our constitutional officers are charging. And in the far left column, you see the code section that authorizes the fee, who the constitutional officer is that collects the fee, the purpose of the fee, and please don't ask me what all these purposes are because I couldn't tell you myself. But there's a list there. And I want to say, too, that this does not include, some people get these fees confused with the fine add-on fees or surcharges. That's really a totally different issue. The fine add-on and surcharges, those are being collected and they're going to specific purposes, but there's not a direct tie with the purpose and the actual person that's being collected from is usually a penalty. Somebody's paying a penalty. Where these fees, there's actually a person that's coming into our courts or one of these constitutional officers' office, and they're being provided a specific service and having to pay a fee for that service. And I guess when you look at tax equity, we know that if the fees don't cover the cost of providing the service, then the only way for local governments to make up the difference is through tax revenues, mainly the property tax coming out of our general fund. So we feel like that we should try to keep the fee as close to the actual cost of providing the service as possible. Obviously, it shouldn't be any more than that, because then it would turn into a tax. You can also see, second to the last column, when the fee was last amended in state law. You can see that several of them was back to 1991, 15 years ago. I don't think anybody up here would have a problem paying what they paid back in 1991 for things today. I mean, that's probably a pretty good deal. One thing you will not see on this chart, and we're continuing to do some research, is what the fee would actually have to be today to cover the full cost of providing that service. And I think that's going to be difficult, because that's going to vary a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on the economies of scale in that jurisdiction. There's a number of factors, which again, that gets into the policy decision. Should these fees be set at the state level through state law, one size fits all, or should some of these be set at the local level? Because in some places it may cost more to provide services than others. So anytime you try to set a state fee, in some places it maybe generates a little more revenue than it actually costs to provide the service, and in other places it may not generate enough. If y'all have any questions about of what's in this chart, I'll try to answer any questions you have. The other handout that I gave you says tax reform proposals from ACCG. I'm not going to go through all these, but there's 16 items here that we feel like should be considered. Most of them deal with tax equity and how we feel like the tax system could be made fair. So if y'all would take a look at those. Most of these we've covered in other meetings that we've already presented at. But we were asked to come, Chairman O'Neill asked us to give y'all some specific things in writing on things that we would like to see reformed, and this is what this is.
All right, Clint, any questions from any of the members? Representative Roy?
Clint, the previous speaker gave an estimate of $25 million to $50 million, allowing, I guess, commercial property owners to enter in the cover. Have y'all done any numbers on that?
We have not. That's something we can take a look at. I know that the current program has really grown exponentially. I'm trying to think off the top of my head what it's costing us today, but it's at least 2 or 3 times that number. I don't know, how much it would actually cost. And I think the real thing with CUVA, they talk about it being a current use type assessment. It's really a lot lower than what a current use assessment would give you. If you look at the people that are in CUVA, if say a timber farmer sold it to somebody else that was going to farm it, in many cases they're going to get more than what their assessment is under the CUVA, because in the CUVA provision there's a 3% inflationary cap. And usually that gets people, that keeps the values down lower than what the current use is. So over time, those values are not even in line with what we consider current use values. So, but we can check on that number. I don't know what it would cost what the estimate would be to put all commercial properties that exist out there now that would qualify under CUVA, that would exceed the 2,000 acre limitation.
I wish you'd look at that. They had a handout that said 90% of all the timberland is owned privately, so they're eligible for the 2,000 acres for CUVA. So that only leaves 10% that would go in there, 10% of the
right.
forest landowner.
And the other thing is the 2,000 acre cap. Obviously, if we remove the 2,000 acre cap, a lot of the people that are currently going to have more than 2,000 acres that they're not getting CUVA value on. And I would assume that the commercial properties, being real large tracts of land, they would want to remove the 2,000 acres because that wouldn't give them much. They wouldn't get a whole lot of benefit if they only got 2,000 acres put into CUVA.
The 2005 estimate by the Department of Revenue for the total cost of Cuba was $149.3 million.
That's right. That's right. And
Second,
that's really grown.
One other question. In the tax proposal, trade a property tax circuit breaker, have y'all done any numbers on that to see what that might be in terms of revenue?
Well, it really depends on how you design it, and we've looked at a lot of other states, and there's hundreds of ways actually you can design one of these. Depends on the income ratio that you set. The way the circuit breaker works, for those who are not familiar, it's tied to your income as a ratio of the value of the property, and when you hit a certain cap, say your income exceeds, the value of the property exceeds a certain percentage of your income, the taxes due, then the circuit breaker kicks in. So it would depend on where you set that level. I think in one state that I looked at recently, it's 5%. When your property taxes exceed 5% of your income, which is a pretty high threshold. So a threshold that high probably wouldn't cost us a lot of money. And then, then how you apply it, we'd have to look at that. I can't give you a number, but
Are y'all going to look at it?
sure. I mean, that's a way. The reason we put that in there is we hear a lot about people being taxed out of their homes or having a lot of difficulty paying the taxes because they've lived there for a long time, and the inflationary increases in the values are outstripping their ability to keep pace with their income. And if you want to provide tax relief, and we believe that that's a legitimate issue that needs to be addressed, but provide tax relief so people can't be taxed out of their homes, then that's the way to do it instead of these. We see a lot of blanket tax exemptions that catch everybody, and those are much more costly than these targeted type tax exemptions.
Any more questions? Representative Knight.
Two questions. One follow-up to Representative Royals. Talking about the tax circuit breaker and income, is that going to be a pretty reliable circuit breaker there? I know we're talking about income and people voluntarily with the income tax returns. I mean, is this going to be inaccurate?
It would have to be done through their tax returns. The way it works in other states is it's actually like an income tax credit. So when they file for their income taxes, they have to show on that form obviously how much they paid in property taxes and then how much their total income was, and that percentage is calculated, and then if they meet the criteria, then they can get a credit back through their income tax.
I'm just worried about all the folks who don't properly file their income taxes.
Well, you would have to file. That would be an encouragement to file income taxes, I guess.
Second, the second question goes back to, I guess, your Excel spreadsheet. I want to make sure I understand this right. I may not, but a lot of the fees are, you're saying, not used. Are we still collecting those fees, and are these no longer being collected?
No.
It says not used.
Yes. What we did, we asked the constitutional officers that helped us compile this list. There's a lot of fees that are on the books that they're no longer utilizing. So where you see a not used in the comment section, those are probably fees we could just take off the books, take out of state law, because they were used at one time in history, but today, for whatever reason, they're no longer being used. But there's still a provision in state law for that fee. So that's really more cleanup to the state code. If we're not using the fee anymore, those are things that we can take out of the state code to help make it cleaner.
Thank you.
Let me ask you about number 14. The term surcharge, you're talking about 911 surcharge. What do you mean by surcharge? And is a wireless phone, is that a cell phone? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Right now, obviously, the telecom industry is changing greatly, and if you go to Walmart, you see the Go phones, and a lot of parents are buying them for their kids. There's no 911 fees being collected on those types of phones. So as things change, the economy changes, and people use those types of phones more, there's less and less 911 revenues to support the 911 system, which means we have to rely on other types of revenue to pay for it. I mean, when we started the 911 system, everybody had landline phones, and that was primarily where we got our revenue, and it was a pretty equitable system because just about everybody had a landline phone. Now you're seeing a lot of people that don't even have landline phones anymore. They're just using cell phones, and now we're seeing a lot of these prepaid phones where you go buy them in the store, you buy so many minutes. So there's not even a service agreement, and those people don't pay any 911 fees right now.
Any other, Representative Martin?
Just real quick, but following up on that, I mean, there's more phone numbers per capita in Georgia than there was 5 years ago, and certainly more than 10 years ago. So you're collecting more 911 fees today than you did 5 and 10 years ago, right?
I'm sure
I mean,
we are, yes.
10 years ago, I paid one 911 fee for one hard line in my house. Now I pay that and four cell phones.
Right.
So, I mean, I understand you're trying to capture this, but I just don't want us to lose sight of the fact that the 911 fees collections are up as a percentage of, are related to population.
Right. I think when it comes to equity, we feel like everybody should be paying. If what's being collected is too much, then we need to roll back the rates. But everybody needs to be paying a share of it. And
are you proposing that we look? I mean, is that a possibility if we were to capture some of these?
Sure.
I mean, are counties and cities collecting more 911 fees than they need?
No, when the 911 fee statute was written, there's a provision in the 911 fee law that specifically says if you collect more than you're supposed to collect, there has to be a rollback. They can't use this for other things.
I understand. Former mayor, trick question, but I just
okay.
thought
I
thought you were volunteering to roll back.
No, we'll have to roll back if we get more than we need.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Clint. We'll take a break. We'll meet back here at 3:45, 3:45, 4.
Thank you.